I have been participating in teacher workshops through Humanities Texas for a number of years now, and they have definitely been some of my favorite workshops of all these many, many years, because the opportunity to be in touch with teachers in our big state is just a pleasure and a privilege that means the world to me. I started working in schools in Texas, especially longer ago than I can even believe. Numbers start becoming as unreal as our sense of what a year has felt like. But I have always felt that the teachers were my heroes. The teachers were the conduits of goodness and wisdom and possibility. The teachers were the people I believed in so much and felt so grateful to all the time. And this topic for tonight, walking through an open door, encouraging creative writing, reading and writing with young people, has been my topic through all these many years at every level of education. I would just like to make a dramatic statement at first. I had a lot of doubts, of course, when I started working in schools all over Texas and later the country and later the world. I thought, can this really happen? Can a visitor show up and encourage poetry writing and really see poems emerge in a short period of time? And I can say now that it has never not happened. It has always happened. It has always been a magical, connecting, powerful world of language that came to us somehow through the times together, even in the most remote locations, the most rural locations, and the most awkward situations. I have always had a belief since I was a child that poetry belongs to all of us, that we're living in a poem every day, that poems are in the air around us at all times. And we just have to sometimes open ourselves to that material that is already available and belonging to us. I hope some of you liked the very short essay from the Washington Post by Jason Basa-Nemec called "Why Kids Need Poetry in Their Lives and How to Spark Their Interest in It." I like this essay a lot, not only because he mentioned one of my books, which stunned me when I started reading this essay. I had never heard of this writer. I had no idea one of my books was about to show up in the essay, but I loved quotes that he gave about poetry. It all starts with someone understanding your feelings. Poetry is that place where language is pleasure and not just communication. You don't need to be intimidated by the form of poetry. The thing I love about younger minds is that their imagination is so elastic. The form is just a way to give a container to it. And poetry helps to shape any individual's identity kit. And another quote, start with what's available at your fingertips. I would have to say, I believe with every single phrase in this essay, and I hope you can find something useful in it that you might be able to take into your own classrooms. I just want to express for a second my feeling of solidarity and sorrow, of course, for what we've all been through this past year, what you've been through. I think it's been an enormous challenge to readjust one's daily schedule and sensibilities to either virtual classroom teaching or socially distanced teaching. Everything has been awkward in some way or another. I've really felt for teachers and for students, and continuing to do a lot of workshop sessions online myself. I've just seen how important this kind of contact has been, student to instructor, in so many different venues. So thank you for all you've done and the way you've had to be so flexible and imaginative, and what a huge challenge it's all been. I did find myself, as many others did, this year going through a million stacks of paper and file cabinets and files and boxes under beds and trying to figure out what is all this stuff that we hoard as human beings. And being a poet, I found lots and lots of half-baked poems. I found many poems that I had used in classrooms in the past. And then I found other items that related to all these many years gone by. And one of the items I found was a letter from a boy in a rural place in Texas, Comstock, Texas. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's a beautiful part of our state. And I worked once in a school there for a week, and the local high school. And it was the only time in my life I was ever asked by the kind people I was staying with just to leave my car at their home, and they would give me a horse to ride to school, and it would be much quicker than taking the roads from their ranch to the school. And I said, but I'm not a good horse rider. I don't ride very often, and I don't know where the school is. And I'll never forget the kind host, who was also a teacher at the school, looking me in the face and saying, "The horse knows. Just get on the horse and say school, and the horse will take you to the school." So it was a very interesting week in all ways. And then later I received, and the horse would jump a creek, by the way. That was the scariest part of my journey. Every day, every morning and coming home, that horse would jump that creek, and I would think, this is it. It's my last day, but I held on tightly, and it was an amazing time. Anyway, I found a note, a letter in the mail that I had received from a boy in one of the classes. And then I wrote this poem so long later, looking him up, wanting to be in touch with him again. And I'd just like to read it to open with a poem. The road between San Antonio and Comstock, Texas. I think of it as a bloodline, clean thread stretching west, the mind emptying so gently as it ranged farther from billboards, chains, farther from access roads, exits, deeper into sky. That road is why I love this state. Despite politics, pronouncements, the boy called Cody in Comstock, who wrote me a year after I visited his class. Basically, poetry changed everything. It made me see where I was. Could you please come back and stay forever? Finding his letter again, 30 years later, looking him up to learn he died young, a cowboy hat over his downturned face. I want to say, your roads are still stretching outwards. Cody, the fields you walked through. We are here soaking in the mystery of time, trapped in our little houses, scared of a virus, feeling connected through the spaces, all of these new ways. And I remember you. I guess one reason I might have wanted to write him a poem was thinking of that expansiveness of the ranch fields as I would ride the horse. The horse's name was Frijole, to school every day. And then the way we've all felt so pent up in our homes these past many months. So thank you for listening to that poem. And it was an example of some of the testimonials children or kids, teenagers would send me, young adults, over the years, basically saying, not that I had done anything, but that poetry had allowed them to see their own worlds anew, afresh, to see that they were living in a world of metaphors and details and all of the things we talk about when we talk about poetry. So here we have a few slides to share with you, and I will talk about poetry as we see them. And please forgive my indulgence that I am showing a few personal slides as well as some with text on them. But I thought this would be more interesting than you just having to look at my face and hear me talk. So the first slide is of two of my childhood books that possibly had something to do with my becoming a poet. The important book is not the most famous book by Margaret Wise Brown. Probably Goodnight Moon is, pictures by Leonard Weisgard. But this was the first book as a child that I had a conversation with. I argued with it. I did not agree that the things that this book states are the most important about each item in the book: the apple, the glass of water, the butterfly, the tree, the clouds, some of the things you see on the cover, and other things besides. I simply did not agree with Margaret Wise Brown's premises that there would be one aspect that was the most important thing about an apple. For example, if it's, but the most important thing about an apple, after listing many details about an apple, is that it's red. I very clearly remember as a 5 and 6-year-old saying, but some apples are green. Or why is that the most important? To me, the most important thing is that it's crunchy. It's delicious, it's healthy. If I ask for one, my mom will give it to me. So this was the first book I could say with which I really had a relationship, a conversation. And I do think poetry is a conversation that we have with the poem as it exists and with ourselves in response to the poem. The other book, Favorite Poems Old and New, is a rather miraculous book. The editor, Helen Ferris, was so humble she didn't even put her name on the cover. This book has been in print around 70 years. She was the president of the Junior Library Guild. And I found an old interview with her where she said she just felt kids weren't being given enough poems. So she wanted to gather together all of the poems she could into a big, thick, beautiful book for them. When this book was given to me for probably my 6th birthday, because I was already in love with poems after hearing them read by my mother starting when I was 3, I remember just feeling as if I had fallen into a wonderland. So many voices, so many topics. Later, as life went on, I realized most of the people in the book were from the English-speaking world. There were worlds. There were a few from New Zealand, Australia, England, Scotland, so forth. And there were only a very few poems in this book in translation, such as one by Rabindranath Tagore, the great Bengali poet, which is why I would go on to create anthologies of many poems in translation for kids, because I knew what this book had meant to me as a child. And I just wanted children to know and be aware of people in the whole world writing poems, poetry being a universal language that belongs to everyone. I still have these 2 books, and when I open Favorite Poems, it's amazing. As many times as I've read this book and looked at it, I still, to this day, always find something new, something I feel I have never read in it before. And that's a big vote for anthologies in classrooms. Kids can discover new voices with ease. Next slide. I am fascinated.
Well, if more on here would pull up.
What? Oh. I'm fascinated by the people whose shoulders we ride on. My father was an immigrant to the United States from Palestine. He spoke Arabic as his first language, English. He was a very good English speaker because he was a journalist. And of course, so he had to write very accurately. But he was a real believer in children. And to me, this picture where he seems to be pointing at my messy coat is an example of the people we look back on later who really gave us courage to speak out. You know, as a journalist, my father was always encouraging kids to write more letters to the editors of newspapers. And he would say, you know, grown-ups need to hear your voices. We need to know your opinions about things. And so I think definitely, although he was not the first person who exposed me to poetry, he was the one who gave me the courage to speak out, and I still ride on his shoulders always. Next slide. I had a teacher when I was in 2nd grade who would mark my life as being the best poetry teacher I ever had. Her name was Harriet Lane. She was at Central School, a public school in Ferguson, Missouri, a place that everyone has heard of now, but in those days, even people on the other side of St. Louis hadn't heard of it. She believed that poetry was at the center of the universe, that we all needed poems. We needed to read them weekly, write them weekly. I'll talk more about her method in a second, but this is the first year, age 7, this is my school picture from 7 years old, when I started sending poems to magazines. Mrs. Lane was not the person who suggested I could do that. That was a gift given me by the librarians. And, this is one thing we need to remember, that simple encouragements, simple voices saying, well, you could try that. What do you have to lose? I remember the school librarian saying, you may have to send out 20 poems before one is ever printed. And my response was, that's okay, I think I have 28. I wasn't anxious about being rejected. I just thought the idea of seeing poems out in the world in print and having readers you didn't personally know was the most exciting thing in the world. I was not thinking of a future career. I was just thinking about being in touch with other people. Next slide. This is a book I recently bought for my grandson, and this is what I was as a child. The Word Collector, Peter Reynolds. It's a book about a boy who's in love with words, possibly you know it. And I think it's a really good habit for us to just focus on individual words sometimes and learning new ones, loving them, turning them over and over in our mouths. I think all writers are word collectors before they're anything else. I love this book. I think even teenagers would love this book. Next slide. Being prepared was something that I often thought about. This is our own child who was an early reader and writer. I was just a kind of regular reader and writer, although I started writing poems in all the margins of my pages when I was 6. He would come to a homework table or a table for writing overly prepared. And I tell kids, it's so simple. It's the cheapest hobby in the world. It's the cheapest art. You need a pencil and a paper. That's the cheapest materials there are. So I just put this in there for humor's sake. And of course, this was in the days before when computers were just coming into being, when he was this age. Next slide. And also, I like to think of the layers of experience we have in our lives. Many times when I go into a school, kids will respond with, but ma'am, we don't have any material. I mean, we've always lived here. When we used to do a lot of neighborhood writing, students would say, but this neighborhood is dull. Nothing has happened here in a very long time. And of course, that would not be true. So we would go out into the schoolyard, walk around the perimeters of the schoolyard, write about what we saw in the distances. Of course, the kids always knew much more history about what had gone on there than I did. And this is actually my Palestinian refugee grandmother's comforter closet. Many people in her home would sleep on the floor for all their lives. And these were the blankets they slept on and the little mattresses. They were all covered in amazing fabrics. And whenever I would visit her in Palestine, I would tease everyone and say that I wanted to sleep in the closet, that I needed, like the Princess and the Pea, all of the layers. I would kind of do anything to make people laugh when I would be there, because I would feel so hungry to know how life was for people who lived there all the time. I only lived there a year in Palestine, and I could see how difficult it was to be in the situation they have been in all these years. But I love this picture of layers. I've never shared it before. And I think many times when we talk about poems, simply the word layers can be the most useful word that we use. And we'll come to that in a minute. Not what does this poem really mean, which is a terrible question to ask about poems, but where are some of the layers in this poem or in you that this poem awakens? Next slide. Okay, recently I received this email from a teacher. I had kind of avoided poetry in my life growing up. It was about analyzing, speaking out loud in class, etc. There was no handle for me, even avid reader that I was, no safe feeling door. Well, I wanted to share this one today since the term open door was in our title. And this was from a person who was identifying as a big reader, and now someone who loves poetry. But she's talking about her many years of teaching and the fact that the word analyzing was the first word she would think of when she thought of poetry. I want to mention that the first time one of my poems was in a textbook in Texas, a textbook that was used in Texas high schools. The questions that were asked, I was only about 23, I think. It was a great honor. I couldn't believe I had a poem in a textbook. But the questions that were asked after the poem were not questions I could easily answer. They were questions that, to me, attempted to baffle a student, to make the poem seem much harder than it really was, to deny the possibility that I meant what I said outright, and to complicate thinking. And I was a little horrified. Much later, a journalist would come to me having somehow managed to collect an essay of mine that was on the Texas state standardized test that was given to high school students. And it was a nonfiction essay. And there were 8 questions asked after the essay. And, you know, this was illegal, what he was doing. He was not supposed to even have that test in his hands. I can't remember how he had gotten it, but he brought it to me and he didn't publish it, his article, until after the test had been given. So he felt it was safe to do then. I was afraid we would both be arrested for test stealing or something. But of the 8 questions that were asked about my own essay, there were only 2 I could answer with confidence. This was about 12 years ago. So I think teachers should think about that when students have problems with some of the questions that are asked after reading a text. Next slide. This to me is what we're interested in more than analysis. We're interested in sources and possibilities with our students of resonating. Now, this poem was written by a boy, Luis Alonso, in response to some poems we had shared in his classroom. We were talking about, you know, what inspires people, where they get thoughts, where they get ideas, paying attention in the world, observation. And this is what he wrote. Where my writing comes from? That one dewdrop that is about to fall off the blade of grass in the center of my yard at 5:30 in the morning. The fuzz on the back of the butterfly who, in his never-ending task, goes to each and every flower in my grandma's yard. Or the joy in my dog's eyes when we remember how we used to play together. I was very moved by the specificity of this piece, the way Luis was really holding on to these details that belong to him. And also the mystery in that last detail. Don't they play together anymore? Is the dog too old to play? Does Luis not have time to play? Many times a poem wants to contain a mystery. And I think that is something that is often overlooked when we talk about poetry. Mystery is a critical part of poetry, just as mystery is a very important part of life. Next slide. Not what does this poem really mean? The question most commonly asked about poems when I was in school, not by Mrs. Lane, but by every teacher thereafter. A great poet, Charles Simic, has said, the worst thing you can do to a poem is paraphrase it in duller language. Also, a poem is not a riddle, not a code. I think about other art forms. Very few of us stand outside, well, in the days when we could go anywhere, a concert hall after hearing a symphony, for example, and stand outside with the other audience members and say, what did that symphony really mean? What did Bach really mean? Or after a ballet, what were they really saying? What was that about? We don't do that. We accept the beauty, the mystery, the joy, the glory of the art form without treating it as a code, a riddle. Better questions to ask might be, What do you like in this poem? Does it take you anywhere? Remind you of anything in your own life? How does it do that? Does the language interest you? How and where? Is there an identifiable scaffolding or structure? How is this poem put together? What did the poet do to make this poem? Is the poem mysterious? Does it offer various possibilities of interpretation? How does it make you feel? Does it taste good to say it out loud? Um, or even other better questions. Maybe you'll offer some in the chat at the end. I have found when you ask questions like this about a poem you share in class, people will sit up straighter. They'll feel as if they have agency in the matter, as if the poem is wanting to engage them as well. It's not just trying to trick them or sit off there with holding its mysterious meaning and you're supposed to figure it out. It will try to give you a sense of the poetry that you're living inside of too, that you're carrying with you. If you disagree with this idea, please let's talk about it in our Q&A. But I really think the top few questions, what do you like in this poem? Does it take you anywhere, remind you of anything in your own life, and how does it do that, have been the most meaningful and useful in all of the workshops I have conducted over the years. I also think if there is a mystery in the poem that you feel you don't quite understand, and that's possible. There are mysteries in most poems, many poems that I don't understand, and I live my whole life reading poems. If you tell the students that, they will try to figure it out for you or for them. They will give many alternative interpretations that will create a much more interesting reading response, a more invested activity than just stand back and figure it out the way I already know it could be figured out. I remember being in high school, my final years of high school in San Antonio, and our class reading a William Wordsworth poem. And everyone in the class insisting that William Wordsworth was on the edge of a cliff ready to jump off. But I felt so different from that with this poem. I felt that this poem was a poem of ecstatic joy that was too great for him to express to anyone. And it was his wonderment at life being full of moments like that. I didn't feel it was a depressed, melodramatic jump off a cliff poem at all. And when I suggested that, that alternative interpretation, I do recall my thoughts not being welcomed at all in the classroom. And years later, when I would stand in William Wordsworth's own cottage in England, in the Lake District, I honestly heard him echoing in the walls, "You were right." I felt that he was still responding to my response to his poem. That sounds crazy, but poets are a little on the edge there. Okay, next slide, please. So this was the brilliant curriculum. I'm going to talk really fast from second grade. Exposure. We all were asked to put a poem on the board every Monday, or a part of a poem, just a stanza, a few lines from a poem. We all had a place on this massive blackboard experience in our second grade classroom. Participation. At some time in the week, we would be asked to come in front of the class and read our lines to the class and say why we liked them or why we picked them. Also, Mrs. Lane was very crafty in telling us, if you forget to bring a poem on Monday, just write one in your spot, make it up, put your own lines there. And then you can talk about it later. And you can change them as the week goes on if you've made them up. Interpretation, discussing with the class, other members of the class, what we liked about the lines, the poem. And then on Fridays, we were asked to select from all the poems around us. We'd been sitting with them all week, probably 30 kids in that class, the poem or the few lines we liked best, and copy them carefully on our pages. And we would create books then of our favorite lines from every week of the year, big, large books on construction paper. This was her curriculum. I'm still in touch with 3 people from that class. They all say, as I do, that she created a different sense of openness and possibility in the world. We all say that, and other people I've met who were her students say that as well. But she never suggested to us that anything was above our heads. She never told us that one poem, one selection that someone had liked was better than someone else's. She never told us our interpretations were wrong. But she made us do all these things regularly every week. So by the end of second grade, every one of us felt like a great poetry reader and a poet. And we were also editors at this point because we had made 4 giant books at this point of our favorite poems from the whole entire year. Her curriculum cost nothing. It was free, and it caused a lot of second graders to be pounding the pavement to the library every single week to find our poems. Next slide. We'll go very fast here. This was just a haiku I loved so much. Chief had a wigwam, but the wind blew it away. He didn't even speak. Next slide. This is a very moving poem to me by the greatest Israeli poet, Yehuda Amichai, who died some years ago, An Eternal Window, but I love how it's a mirror inside a mirror, which I really think is what poetry wants to be. The poems we read want to echo something in us. An eternal window, in a garden I once heard a song or an ancient blessing. And above the dark trees, a window is always lit in memory of the face that looked out of it. And that face too was in memory of another lit window. All of our students are lit windows. And I think poetry helps them light up even more. Next slide. These are just kids in Abu Dhabi on International Day who were writing poems as fast as they could. Next slide. These are some quotes from my favorite poet of my lifetime, first encountered in my high school English textbook in Texas when I was 17. And he would go on to be my favorite poet for my whole life. He believed that we start writing meandering sequences of thoughts, spun out patterns of words as a kind of regular practice, and poems then emerge. We find poems. I never feel sure I have anything worthy, he said. To get started, I will accept anything that occurs to me. I often tell kids, he would write about a menu. He would write about a sign. His favorite line, I think on this page for me, a writer is not so much someone who has something to say as someone who has found a process that will bring about new things he would not have thought of, she would not have thought of if we had not started to say them. You know, the practice of writing responsively to what we read is how we become better readers, better writers. We must forgive ourselves and each other much in our writing and in our talking. A poem today is anything said in such a way or put on the page in such a way as to invite from the hearer or reader a certain kind of attention. Let me say that a poem comes from a life, not a study. One of my most recent books is called Castaway, and it's about trash. And I've always done this little thing in classrooms when students would tell me they had nothing to write about. I would carry the classroom trash can and put it right next to their desk and say, then write about this. And invariably, the trash can poem would be the best one out of that session. Starting anywhere we are, starting with what we have. Kenneth Koch, one of the premier advocates of writing with students in classrooms back in the 70s, said, we're trying to help students discover the material they already have. We're not trying to give them something we don't have. Maybe tactics, strategies, structures, looking at other people's poems and talking about them in a way that feels useful for our own writing and also makes us hungrier readers because we feel like that work belongs to us. William Stafford, I think, was one of the most encouraging voices of the 20th century, and a full digital archive of his work exists now at the Lewis and Clark College Library, and it's available to all. You don't have to be on the campus to access it. I have used his poems possibly more than any other single person's poems in classes over the last 48 some years. Next slide. We're almost done here. So here's my book, Castaway: Poems for Our Time, about trash, and in a little portrait of its own realm. And the next slide, is that it? Oh, and this is just a poem written for the opening of the Planet Word Museum, which opened virtually this year in Washington, D.C. So this is a gift for that day. You can watch the launch of that museum. It's 30 minutes long. I think it's something you'd like to show to your students, because every person on the launch, and I had no idea who the other people would be when they invited me to write the opening poem and be on the launch. Every person blew my mind with how great they were. So it's definitely a launch that relates to language and language we share. And there's a whole big poetry section in that museum. Again, it's Planet Word, Washington, D.C. Welcome the word. Round in the mouth of the day, the word whirls and waits to be recognized, warming each time someone speaks or writes it. Words always willing to be shaped, cajoled, connected. Learn their histories, find their roots. Words have families too. Words want us to know them better. Slipped into lives, they blossom. Words get so lonely if they go a long time floating, weightless. You could carry a word all your life as a guide. It will shimmer, befriend you. Your word will change. This simple poem takes me back to the word collector. You know, having kids simply start writing about a favorite word of the moment is an interesting thing to do during the times we're living through. Next slide. Are there any others? Sorry, I'm going to stop talking in just a second here. Oh, this is one of my favorite poets I know in the world these days. He's 6 now. He was 4 in this picture. I met him when he was 2. His name is Kaimana. He lives in Honolulu. And he is what I would consider a prodigy poet. His mother says he started speaking in poetry when he was 2. I have seen him stand up when he was 2 in front of 90 adults and say poems out of his mind into a microphone, quite astonishing. But his mother says that this all started simply because she read him poems from when he was a baby. And then at age 2, he started speaking in poems. That exposure can be the crucial element for so many kids. Next slide. And this is the studio from which I am speaking to you in downtown San Antonio. I think of myself as a minimalist, but I guess I'm lying to myself. Okay, does anyone have a question about anything I have chattered on about? To me, the two elements are intricately interwoven. It's very hard to study poetry and talk about poetry without writing it. It's very hard to write poetry in a vacuum without reading it and sharing it. The two activities need to be interwoven always. Our great Texas journalist, Bill Moyer, says he became a poet, a poetry lover, simply because of his high school English teacher who read a poem to her students when they came into the classroom in Marshall, Texas. Every day after lunch, they had English after lunch. It was very hot, no air conditioning when he was in high school. And she would keep the lights dimmed and read a poem to those students. And he would just sit there in wonderment of how the words carried him away, gave him a feeling of larger life, which is what they always did for me. And that's why so many years later, he would devote himself to poetry in series of poetry programs, in books he made. Bill Moyers was possibly one of the greatest champions I've known personally, or in American television, who brought a sense of poetry belonging to everybody kind of back into the mainstream, something poets really believe. I'm sorry for talking too much, but I would love to have a Q&A before we go into our breakout session. And back to that welcome the word poem. I am going to hold up a page from the New York Times just 2 weeks ago or a week ago. They had a whole page, you may have seen this if you read the New York Times. How has a pandemic year changed your idea of home? And the responses from people all around the country, they're written in little paragraphs, but they all read like poems. The responses are so poetic and so exquisite that I definitely plan to use this question and this page as a modeling, along with poems about home from poets all over the world. So of course, it's a universal topic. But this year, we've all had an expanded feeling of what home is and what it's had to be and what we've had to be in it. So, when you find materials like this, just put them in your picnic basket under your messy desk. You've seen mine now, and keep them as resources for poetry writing projects. Thank you to Margaret, who had to hop off. Is there a question from anyone?